The relationship between the left brain and the right brain is more complicated than you think, but by the end of this video, you'll understand it better than 99% of people. Let's get into it.
Buckle up, buckaroo!
This book took me 1.5 years to read, and I'm about to summarize it for you. There's going to be 3 parts: the story of the title, how the left and the right brain work, and how our brain has shaped the world. Now, this summary is going to be a massive oversimplification. The preface alone is 20 pages of Iain McGilchrist saying that the last 20 years of reactions and summaries to this book are just massive oversimplifications that are either misquotations or just outright contradictions. The book itself is 462 pages of rigorous arguments, just like a scientific paper, plus 54 pages of footnotes in type that's so small, I might need glasses now. But it's all backed up by over 5,000 citations of scientific papers, books, philosophical writings, and artistic classics. Now, hopefully, as I spend the next
58 minutes, 43 seconds
summarizing, I only leave out stuff. And the stuff that I leave in is at least relatively accurate, which feels like a very hemispherically balanced approach. Now, I'll do my best, but The Master and His Emissary by Iain McGilchrist is very much worth the read and the time investment. If you want to go ahead and do it. Get right into it. The story of the title. The title, The Master and His Emissary, refers to a parable that McGilchrist tentatively credits to Nietzsche. No one has actually been able to track down where the original parable is from, so for all intents and purposes, McGilchrist came up with it, which I'm fine with. It seems fair. He did write the book anyway. Now, since this is the central metaphor of the book, I'm about to tell you the story. But to preempt the metaphor, the master is the right hemisphere and the emissary is the left hemisphere.
Once upon a time, there was a wise master, known for his benevolence, who ruled over a small community. Under his wise leadership, the community flourished and grew, to the point that he came to realize that there were certain matters that he should delegate to his emissaries, either out of necessity due to his expanding domain, or because he wisely knew that there were some matters of which he should remain ignorant, to maintain his quality as a leader and the quality of his domain. With great care he cultivated and trained his emissaries, and they served their master well. The cleverest of these emissaries the master trusted the most, though he was also the most ambitious. This most effective and efficient emissary saw his master's wise benevolence not as the virtue it was, but rather as a weakness. Because of this, the emissary began to view the master with contempt, believing himself more deserving of the role of the master, and taking on the role of master himself while carrying out missions on his master's behalf. The emissary, valuing his own cunning and judgment over that of the wise master, usurps the master, becomes a tyrant, and collapses the master's empire into ruins.
So, fun. All right, part 2, moving right along. Part 2, how the left brain and the right brain work. So the first half of the book, an introduction and 6 chapters, is mostly neuroscience, brain stuff. There's a lot of big words like telencephalon and Yakovlevian torque and right occipitotemporoparietal junction. I'm going to skip that stuff, but it is fascinating if you want to read the book yourself and learn about it.
Do it.
So without further ado, everything I'm about to say is backed up with citations in the book, so I'm going to skip the citations here. First, I actually am going to tell you what Yakovlevian torque is, because it's pretty simple and we will need it for later. So here is the diagram that McGilchrist uses to illustrate it. Pretty much in all typical human brains, the back left of the brain is a little heftier than the back right, and the front right of the brain is similarly heftier than the front left. These front right and back left bulges are called patalia. Because of where these patalia are, it looks like the brain has been twisted around a central point, hence torque. And this guy is Yakovlevian torque. Now the next important thing is why the two hemispheres are different. Going back to sea anemones, who haven't changed since 700 million years ago, every animal's neural structure is asymmetrical. We needed to pay attention to the world, or attend to the world, pay attention, attend, same thing, in two different ways. So we can do two complementary things. Focus on doing stuff, and also watch out for unexpected stuff. The left hemisphere is for focusing on stuff. It's abstract, fragmented, decontextualized, utilitarian. It pays attention to parts, tools, and the known, the familiar. The right hemisphere is for watching out for unexpected stuff. It's holistic, embodied, contextual, relational. It pays attention to the whole, the new, and the living. The simplest way I can describe the different ways that the hemispheres attend to the world is this. You know that saying, he couldn't see the forest for the trees? The left sees the abstract concept of a tree, and the right experiences the tree-ness within the forest. I think that made sense. Chapters 1, 2, and 4 establish that the brain isn't physically or functionally symmetrical, that the two sides pay attention to different stuff in different ways, like we just said, and that the different way that they do things means they engage with the world differently. Here's an illustrative but incomplete set of differences. I'll speed walk you through them, or just look at the list and then skip to
8 minutes 58 seconds.
All right, here we go. The left hemisphere, as we said, fragmented, abstract, decontextualized, utilitarian. Right hemisphere, holistic, embodied, contextual, relational. We already did the ones below it, pays attention to parts, tools, the known familiar. Right hemisphere pays attention to the whole, the gestalt. The gestalt is the whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, and then the new and the living. In bird brains, this is like the doing things versus paying attention to things. The left brain pecks at seeds, doing things. Right brain scans for predators, pays attention to the unknown. Now what they do, the left brain is precise, focused grasp, manipulation, categorization. The right brain, broad, flexible vigilance, awareness, and understanding of context. The left brain deals in certainty, facts. The right brain deals in possibility, what could be. The left brain sees maps and representations, concepts, not the thing, the concept. The right sees reality, the other. We're going to be using that word a lot. The other, that which is separate from us. The left brain divides. The right brain integrates. The left brain is impersonal. The right brain is personal. The left brain uses rationality. The right brain uses reason. These are very important. We'll come back to them. There is a large difference. The left brain, the nature of the worlds, the left brain is static, fragmented, abstract, explicit. The right brain is living, dynamic, interconnected, and implicit. The left brain sees the map. The right brain sees the territory. You know that saying, the map is not the territory? Yeah. The left brain categorizes, the right brain sorry, that took me a second to realize what I had written. I rewrote it. It said individuals. Individuality. It sees the individuality. It sees the novelty. Now, the right hemisphere is also the primary side associated with empathy, social understanding, and music, and is in many ways much more sophisticated than its processing in the left hemisphere. So it's not just emotional.
I am the right brain. I have feelings.
This difference in the things that the hemispheres do is called functional specialization. We evolved this way because it's a good way to stay effective while minimizing resource consumption. Thrilling. Your brain is only about 2% of your body's mass, but it uses 20% of your energy. If both hemispheres had to micromanage each other and cross-check everything all the time, who knows how much more energy it would need. So, to go back to our metaphor, that lack of oversight from one hemisphere to the other is the benevolence that is viewed as a weakness by the left hemisphere, but we know is necessary for the right hemisphere. It's also important to note how the hemispheres are connected. The left and the right hemispheres are primarily connected by a group of 300 to 800 million neuron fibers called the corpus callosum, or callosum. Pronunciations vary. I don't think it matters. Only mammals have developed anything like this, and it's by far the most developed in humans. As brains evolved to be larger, the relative size and interconnection of the corpus callosum actually decreases. You would think it increases, but it decreases, meaning that we are in a long-term process of increasing functional specialization. Most neurons in your brain are either excitatory or inhibitory. They tell things downstream to fire, or they tell things downstream not to fire. Because most of the corpus callosum's neurons are inhibitory, we can infer that the primary way that the left hemisphere responds to the input of the right is very specifically by saying no or by not saying no. Not saying no is not saying yes. It's just the absence of a no.
You know what the number one erogenous zone is, bud? Bing, bing, bing. It's the brain, okay? And everybody being on the same page.
We'll come back to this functional specialization later. The third chapter deals with language, truth, and music. Language is primarily processed in the left hemisphere, which we would expect, given what we know about the left hemisphere specializing in representations. This is not a pipe, after all. More on this later. The two brain regions most tied to language processing, Broca's area, which does speech production, and Wernicke's area, which does speech and language comprehension, are both on the left. And the left hemisphere has a much more complex and nuanced syntax on top of its much larger vocabulary. The right, however, processes metaphor, prosody of speech, the musicality, like tone, and pragmatics, the way that context contributes to meaning. Is what pragmatics is. The left hemisphere views propositional truths, truths as expressed via language, as absolute truths. The right hemisphere rightly knows, that language is insufficient to convey the totality of truth and is better at integrating the nuances associated with this gap. If we over-rely on the left hemisphere, as we have been, spoiler alert, our grasp on the truth slips, and the master's empire starts to fall into disarray. The right hemisphere is highly responsive to music, whereas the left hemisphere is much less so. There's a fascinating group of sections on how music actually came before language, worth buying the book just for that one.
Do it!
But finally, the right hemisphere is capable of grasping poetry, humor, and irony, which the left hemisphere cannot even comprehend.
All of you!
Daddy, chill.
What the hell is even that?
Now this is where we bring back Yakovlevian torque, and particularly the right frontal patalia bulge. These functions and more are associated with activity in the right frontal patalia. McGilchrist, citing over 100 studies in this chapter, extends this to suggest that.
It is the right frontal lobe which enables us to achieve all the rest of which language is capable, which makes empathy, humor, irony possible, and helps us to communicate and express not just facts, but ourselves. Here, language becomes not just a tool of manipulation, but a means of reaching out to the other. Where the left hemisphere's relationship with the world is one of reaching out to grasp, and therefore to use it, the right hemisphere's appears to be one of reaching out. Just that. Without purpose.
I love that. The fifth chapter makes the case that the right hemisphere is primary to the left hemisphere, that it precedes it and is foundational to it. He's already established many of the ways that the left and the right hemispheres are different. Here, he describes that most, if not all, of the left hemisphere's functions or jobs depend on input from the right. The left hemisphere makes the implicit explicit, but that requires an input of implicit information. The right hemisphere acquires this and passes it on so that the left can analyze it and pass it back for integration, which is the thing the right hemisphere does from a big old chart. He draws on evidence showing that physical gestures slightly precede the speech attached to them. Expressive physical gestures preferentially activate the right hemisphere, whereas speech is a primarily leftward function. The entire nervous system itself also behaves in a manner more in line with the right hemisphere's attitude than the left hemisphere's attitude, in a reverberative, reciprocal fashion, rather than linear, sequential, and unidirectional. He quotes Marshall Kinsburn.
When cell stations in the brain connect, the traffic is almost always bidirectional. Areas interact equally in both directions, directly, reciprocally, or indirectly by looping across several cell stations so that the neural traffic reverberates through its starting point.
He gives more examples, and you should buy the book for those.
Do it.
In essence, the right hemisphere is attuned to the outside world and engages with the outside world. The other passes this information to the left hemisphere for analysis, and then the analyzed information is reintegrated into the right hemisphere. And remember, the left hemisphere can only respond to the input of the right by either saying no or not saying no.
It is only the right hemisphere that is in direct contact with the embodied lived world. The left hemisphere is, by comparison, a virtual, bloodless affair. In this sense, the left hemisphere is parasitic on the right.
But there is also what McGilchrist calls a necessary ignorance.
The right hemisphere needs not to know what the left hemisphere knows, for that would destroy its ability to understand the whole. At the same time, the left hemisphere cannot know what the right hemisphere knows. The left hemisphere cannot deliver anything new direct from outside, but it can unfold or unpack what it is given. Its very strength lies in the fact that it can render explicit what the right hemisphere has to leave implicit. Yet that is also its weakness. From inside its own system, from its own point of view, what it believes it has created appears complete.
The sixth and final chapter of part one is called The Triumph of the Left Hemisphere, which is terrifying if you know what he's talking about. In it, McGilchrist describes how the left and the right hemispheres interact across three scales. Level 1, automatic millisecond to millisecond interactions. Level 2, conscious minute to minute interactions. And level 3, abstract asymmetries that transcend time. Level 1, the automatic millisecond to millisecond interactions, recap and further explore the patterns of functional specialization and inhibition, each side having separate and distinct jobs to do, ignorant of what the other's job is, and minimalizing overlap by not saying no or by saying no. Level 2 discusses how we can tend to prefer one hemisphere over the other on a longer time scale, consciously behaving more in the character of the left or the right, with corresponding variation in brain activity, a phenomenon called hemispheric utilization bias. He also talks a lot about consciousness and the different kinds of self. I'll skip over this here, but I did my master's thesis on the evidence side, so don't worry, it'll come up again. Level 3 discusses 5 asymmetries, 2 that favor the right hemisphere and 3 that skew towards the left hemisphere. The 2 that favor the right hemisphere are ontological asymmetry, that the right hemisphere engages directly with reality while the left doesn't. There's asymmetry there. Starting to see what I'm talking about. And the second, asymmetry of function. The right provides the left with information, and the left has to return its information to the right. The right starts and ends the process. And then the three that skew towards the left hemisphere. There's asymmetry of means. The way or the means by which the left hemisphere operates is fundamentally domineering and impersonal, while the right is the opposite, open and personal, aka intentionally vulnerable. The second left hemisphere skewing asymmetry is the asymmetry of structure. The left hemisphere's natural view, built of language, the explicit, and the concrete, fundamentally exclude anything that is not built of those qualities. McGilchrist says it builds for itself a carnival-style hall of mirrors. Remember that, hall of mirrors. We'll come back to it. Out of its creations that it refuses to escape from. And the last one, asymmetry of interaction. When two entities maintain balance through opposition, they maintain what's called a dynamic equilibrium. One pushes one way, the other pushes back to the norm. But given the qualities of the two opposing forces and the cultural evidence over the last couple thousand years that we're about to get to, the equilibrium seems to have shifted. And the left hemisphere is running away with the rest of the ice cream cake. We are, as McGilchrist says, sleepwalking into the abyss. And just like that, part 3, how our brain has shaped the world, aka culture. The second half takes what we've learned about the two hemispheres and maps it onto how Western thought and culture have developed, inferring a coherent, evidence-based through line for how the hemispheres operated and related to each other during those times, starting from ancient Greece all the way through 2009 when the book was published. Thousands of years. In a brief first chapter, he establishes the central role of imitation as the key skill that has been selected for in this progression of the human race. As skills like swimming, hunting, blacksmithing, coal mining, advertising, and coding come and go, those with a greater ability to imitate and quickly learn whatever skill is in demand will succeed and reproduce. And we, on a societal level, become what we imitate in a way that is pushed from behind, which effectively means it's a fairly deterministic, unconscious process. Let's start our story. The ancient world! Athens, Alexandria, and Rome.
Marble statues.
A surprising lack of clothing during sporting events. In the ancient world of Greece, Rome, Athens is in Greece, the right and the left brain merged. They cooperated. They had a great relationship. Why can't we have that again? McGilchrist cites The Origin of Consciousness in The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes, published in 1976. Jaynes claims in this book that consciousness, defined as introspective self-awareness, arose in Homeric Greece around the time of Homer, who wrote the Odyssey. When people in the Old Testament or the Iliad heard the voice of God or the gods, they were hearing their own thoughts as external voices, is what Jaynes claims. Now today, this is the primary theory behind auditory hallucinations and schizophrenia. And here, we know that it's likely associated with a degraded or atypically functioning temporoparietal junction. Citation. But Jaynes claims that back at that time, these thoughts were perceived as external because of the novelty of noticing their previously unconscious intuitive thoughts.
What the hell was that?
Now, Janes concludes that the hemispheres broke down or separated, but McGilchrist concludes the opposite. Janes concluded that the breakdown was due to his view of the similarities between the voice hearing and schizophrenia, which makes sense. I mean, you hear voices, that's schizophrenia right there. But McGilchrist refutes this, citing an updated understanding of schizophrenic phenomenology, where it's not regression to irrationality, lack of self-awareness, and a retreat into the infantile realm of emotion and the body, but rather a misplaced hyper-rationalism, a hyper-reflexive self-awareness, and a disengagement from emotion and embodied existence. The new phenomenon of voices or externalized thoughts can be explained by a newfound detachment between the self and the world, calling the source of those thoughts into question. And on page 262 of our current favorite book, he says, the best example of this is the fascinating rise in drama, plays in the Greek world, in which the thoughts and feelings of ourselves and of others are apparently objectified, yet then returned to us as our own. A sort of special seeing arises in which both distance and empathy are crucial. Now, obviously, this development has pros and cons. New insight is great, but it laid the groundwork for the problems that we'll see later.
The Renaissance.
Da Vinci,
Michelangelo.
Raphael.
Donatello, Assassin's Creed.
In the next few chapters, I'm inevitably going to have to use some much debated terms, such as the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and Romanticism. To the left hemisphere, these look like categories that should be definable. To the right hemisphere, they look like products of experience, of loose constellations of phenomena which have a family resemblance.
Now, in the Renaissance, the left and the right hemispheres were balanced, with the right being primary. In art, we got the adoption of perspective, which you can see in these two paintings. This one, painted before the Renaissance, has no perspective. The foreground and the background are essentially on the same plane, pretty much. But in this one, the foreground, that which is closer, is bigger, and the things that are in the background, far away, are small. You get it? Perspective. But we also, in addition to this depth of space, we get depth of time. In this painting, Adoration of the Shepherds by Domenico Ghirlandaio, spelled right here, you can see that it is a painting of the shepherds visiting the baby Jesus. However, the shepherds are painted in the garb of modern day, at the time of the Renaissance, clothes of the people who lived at that time. So they were effectively stand-ins that the viewer could empathize with in that time, which gives the separation of maybe 1500 years a lived element to it, which is a very right hemisphere function. And we got that because of the anachronisms of time, of the fashion. Now, there was also a very important increase in understanding of the importance of individual experience in the Renaissance.
Individuality gives rise to a seeking after originality, a turning away from the received, communal, and conventional patterns of behavior and thought. The new emphasis on originality and individuality changed the role of the artist, which came into focus with the Renaissance, when the artist for the first time becomes a kind of hero. There are a number of stories of artists such as Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Holbein being deferred to, or at any rate treated as an equal by, the noble or king for whom they worked. The Emperor Maximilian got a nobleman to hold the ladder for Duret, and Charles V himself is said to have stooped to pick up Titian's paintbrush for him. The deference shown is really a deference to the working of divine inspiration within the artist, in the terms of this book, relating to the implicit, intuitive, unwillable skills that come from the right hemisphere.
The Reformation. Martin Luther. New churches that...
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Now, for the Reformation, there are two ways that the brain can respond to the insufficiency of the left hemisphere's representation of the world. First, a return to the fresh vibrance of the right hemisphere's experience, or a rejection of the right hemisphere's vivaciousness as inauthentic and invalid, which results in a leftward value entrenching feedback loop. Now, the Renaissance was the first of those, but the Reformation was the second. We start to see shifts into leftward dominance in the Reformation, where that individuality we just talked about, that spark of the divine, that creative possibility, it shifts from that to individuality as the right to free thinking. Traditions, which were once seen as an inexhaustible source of wisdom, start to be seen as tyrannical, superstitious, and irrational. Now, there are a lot of examples of leftward hemispheric shifts pre- and post-Reformation, especially in the church. Sacred centers giving way to centers of attention is one, where the main focus of the church shifts from the altar to the pulpit. And church patrons start sitting in ordered pew rows, which are pretty much just like boxes on the ground, rather than standing in living crowds, as was common before them, etc. Now, this doubling down on the left hemisphere continues and continues and eventually becomes the Enlightenment. Descartes rejects intuition and thinks therefore he is. Newton gets litigious. Kant categorically can't if no one else can. In the Enlightenment, the left hemisphere doubles down on its worldview. The key development here is that rationality starts to supersede reason. Now, you would think that these are the same thing, but they are very much not. Rationality is the left hemisphere's way of making sense of things, and reason is the right hemisphere's way of making sense of things. So rationality is rigid, mechanical, context independent, and governed by explicit laws. It's concerned with knowing, whereas reason is flexible. It resists fixed formulation, is shaped by context. It's not independent of it. It's shaped by it, and it's shaped by experience, and it involves the whole living being. It's not concerned with knowing. It's concerned with understanding. Now, we've established that the right informs the left hemisphere, the left processes, and then gives back to the right. So the right informs the left, which then informs the right. So reason informs rationality, which then informs reason. So the left hemisphere, in doubling down and starting to be convinced of its own superiority, only accepts steps 2 and 3. So we start from rationality rather than from reason.
The value of rationality, as well as whatever premises it may start from, has to be intuited. Neither can be derived from rationality itself.
Now, McGilchrist uses René Descartes, arguably the most influential Enlightenment philosopher, he did the whole I think therefore I am thing, to illustrate how this hyper-rationality is, in a word, schizophrenic. Descartes rejected all sense perceptions in favor of pure rationality, to the point that he embodied many of the characteristics that we would today associate with schizophrenia. He was divorced from his body, excessively detached from experience, unreasonably hyper-rational, and reflexively self-aware, to the point that he was divorced from his thoughts. To illustrate his doubting the existence of his own body, Descartes wrote this in Meditations on First Philosophy.
I can make a probable conjecture that the body exists, but this is only a probability. And despite a careful and comprehensive investigation, I do not yet see how the distinct idea of corporeal nature, which I find in my imagination, can provide any basis for a necessary inference that some body exists.
Now, I'll move on for time, but here are the rest of the chapter's subheadings to pique your interest. Romanticism. Jane Austen. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This painting that I have above my desk. Wordsworth, or as Lord Byron and now me call him, Turdsworth. Now, during Romanticism, the right hemisphere is released, opening us up to engage with broader context. The main thrust of Romanticism, in this stream of ideas, is the recognition that differences, paradoxes, and tension were just as important as the coherence, non-contradiction, and mutual compatibility that were prevalent and valued during the Enlightenment. Now, there are three highlights from this era that I want to tell you about. First is the return to depth that we saw in the Renaissance, as well as a new emphasis on light in paintings. Second is a new emphasis on melancholy and longing in poetry and other forms of art. And then finally, Turdsworth, good old Turdsworth, and his recognition of the power of nature. Now, the depth in time that happened in Renaissance art returns, along with a new emphasis on light in paintings, with a strong emphasis on the contrast in lit and unlit spaces, as can be seen in these paintings. Prominent themes of melancholy and longing appear in poetry and art. Melancholic remembrance of the past is contrasted against the Enlightenment's drive for the future in a lot of the Romantic works. McGilchrist quotes Chidiock Tishburne's elegy. The spring is past, and yet it hath not sprung. The fruit is dead, and yet the leaves are green. My youth is gone, and yet I am but young. I saw the world, and yet I was not seen. My thread is cut, and yet it was not spun. And now I live, and now my life is done. Now for longing, McGilchrist contrasts left hemisphere wanting, which is reaching out for an object, and right hemisphere longing or yearning, which is being pulled towards the other, which is attracted. So reaching out or being pulled towards, they're two different things. He says this.
Longing for the loved one. It is a movement of faith in a state of uncertainty. As Percy Shelley put it, the devotion to something afar from the sphere of our sorrow.
Well, Percy, maybe if you were devoted to your wife Mary a little bit more, we wouldn't have gotten Frankenstein. So thank you for your service, sir. And I'm sorry for what you went through, Mary, if you went through something. I'm not exactly sure, but great art comes from pain.
My emotions! My emotions!
Wordsworth, or Turdsworth. Man, I love that. And the redemptive power of nature. Now, Turdsworth, as we are calling him, specialized in
allowing, painfully, something to come into being out of an almost luminous absence or emptiness. Retrospection towards a realm that is lost is at the center of Wordsworth's poetry.
And much of his work illustrates the right hemisphere's mode of interaction with the other, that of open receptivity, or a seemingly paradoxical active passivity. And nature is often the thing he's encountering. Now, he says that this is common in children, but it's lost as one matures into adulthood. And in his poetry, he used prepositions and conjunctions, words that connect other words, to evoke an experience of betweenness. And double negatives, I'm not doing this, that kind of thing, to bring to mind both a thing and its opposite at once. Now, by combining the betweenness and the paradox, he tries to, quote, circumvent the ordinary processes of everyday language, leap us past the familiar, back in touch with the other, like children again. Love you, Turdsworth. Then there is a small but important section about the Industrial Revolution, which contains this terrifying banger of a sentence.
But what if the left hemisphere were able to externalize and make concrete its own workings, so that the realm of actually existing things, apart from the mind, consisted to a large extent of its own projections?
Then this one, which makes me freak out just as much.
Then the ontological primacy of right hemisphere experience would be outflanked, since it would already be delivering not the other, but what was already the world as processed by the left hemisphere.
Remember that hall of mirrors we talked about that the left hemisphere can build around itself to insulate itself from the right hemisphere's input? Yeah, what if, just spitballing here, what if the left hemisphere was able to build a hall of mirrors in the outside world so that the right hemisphere thinks it's encountering the other or the really real, but it's just seeing what the left hemisphere wants it to see?
Let me out! Let me out! This is not a dance! I'm begging for help! I'm screaming for help!
And like it's like I'm always saying that it's like the deep state, but like glial cells, man. Like
He warned us. Noam Chomsky, he warned us. He warned us.
No one talks
I
about it.
didn't listen to them.
Like where do you think it's pretty clear when you look at the evidence.
Where we are now.
And like it's like I'm always saying, man. It's like no one's gonna tell you because they're afraid. But you know what? I'm not. I'm not afraid, man. Like, come again. They're on the pedaling out of this area. They're hoarding 80% of the neurons.
Now, during the period of modernism, the left carries out its plan, and we start to see the consequences. Modernism started on or about December 1910, according to Virginia Woolf, which is oddly specific, though it might be referring to Roger Fry's November 1910 art exhibition, Manet and the Post-Impressionists. Now, I would fact check this, but I'm afraid of Virginia Woolf, so I'm just going to take her at her word. Now, over the course of this period of modernism, the left hemisphere takes in its pre-curated input that the right has been feeding it, and of course, sees only its creations, not the other. It sees itself with no betweenness.
The left hemisphere's task is to look for meaning, but that meaning can only come to the representational world by allowing a betweenness with the world it represents, as worlds need their real-world reference to have meaning.
So because of this, the world is emptied of meaning and becomes devitalized.
Devitalization leads to boredom, and boredom in turn to sensationalism.
Now, it's important to note that use of the word boredom shot up during this period.
The high-stimulus society in which we live is represented through advertising as full of vibrancy and vitality, but as advertisers only know too well, its condition is one of boredom and the response to boredom. There is a vicious cycle between feelings of boredom, emptiness, and restlessness on the one hand, and gross stimulation and sensationalism on the other.
Power nap! Stress nap! Victory nap!
Now, I'm sure that this is something that we can all relate to, being even mildly aware of the internet and social media. McGilchrist quotes Scheller, viewing our culture of entertainment as a collection of extremely merry things viewed by extremely sad people who do not know what to do with them. Now, the main problem here is that during this period, symbols, representations of things, abstractions of things, replace the things themselves. Now, this is really well illustrated by this painting. It says, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," which is French for "this is not a pipe." And it's not a pipe. This is a painting of a pipe. But people, if you ask a kid, hey, what's that? Like, that's a pipe, which kids should know what pipe is. You can't smoke when you're that age. Anyway, in art, we see the effects of this reification, this making real of representation, and the corresponding subjugation of reality growing more abstract as compensation. Now, this period is when we get Picasso, who painted this about the Spanish Civil War, clearly. Or the surrealist Salvador Dali, whose most famous work is literally melting clocks, a perfectly tangential abstraction away from the depth of time that we experience when looking at Renaissance or Romantic paintings. We also get highly geometric and left hemisphere type subcategories of art. Because the left hemisphere loves categories, like cubism and pointillism, the latter of which notably reduces the gestalt, the whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, the right hemisphere's domain, into discrete, separate particles. And music in this period becomes more rhythmic and less melodic, more mathematical and less emotionally subtle. We get minimalism, functionalism, absurdism, isms galore.
Isms, in my opinion, are not good. A person should not believe in an ism. He should believe in himself.
Now, there were also good things about modernism, but that's not good for retention. You'll have to buy the book about that one.
Do it.
So on to postmodernism. In postmodernism, the symbols and the representations that have been substituted for reality lose what little meaning they were able to hold on to.
Art becomes a game in which the emptiness of a wholly insubstantial world is allowed to speak for its own emptiness. There is nothing beyond the set of terms which we have used in vain to construct meaning, which are now seen simply to refer to themselves.
Now, during this period, a specific critical attitude becomes common, one seen in schizophrenic patients, by psychosis researcher Louis Sass to be a distinctive combination of superiority and impotence.
Where an author thought he was doing something important, even profound, the critic can reveal that he was really playing a word game, the rules of which reflected socially constructed norms of which the author was unaware. The author becomes a sort of puppet whose strings are pulled by social forces behind the scenes. He is placed. Meanwhile, the work of art gets to be decoded, as if the value of the work lay in some message of which the author was once more unaware, but which we in our superiority can now reveal.
Now, in the postmodern worldview, there is no objective reality. There is no other, no ultimate truth to determine or interpret. There is only the left hemisphere's self-important freedom to analyze its creation. The ecstasy of chaos, as Robert Graves calls it. McGilchrist notes that this is different from the Enlightenment's left hemisphere dominance in a major, dangerous way.
A couple hundred years and another level of consciousness later, the observing subject is not just aware, but aware of its own awareness. It is no longer an option to ignore the fact that all cannot be made to agree, that all is not fixed, certain, and knowable, and that all is not necessarily going to end up being redeemed by human control.
So, what are we supposed to do about it? Well, he does tell us more things. Do you want to hear the good news or the bad news first? I can't hear you. I don't know why I asked that. I'm going to start with the bad news, because then we end on good news, and that's good. We like that. All right, here we go. So the bad news is that he describes what the left hemisphere's ideal world would look like, and it looks a lot like our last few years. Here's just a few highlights that he notes. Knowledge gained through experience is vague and therefore suspect. So formal systems use paper qualifications instead. College degree. More and more work would come to be overtaken by the meta process of documenting or justifying what one was doing or was supposed to be doing. Governments would seek total control, not only attempting to take power directly, but by playing down individual responsibility, where the sense of individual responsibility declines accordingly. Reasonableness is replaced by rationality, to the point that the concept of reasonableness might become unintelligible. I hope we're not all the way there on that one. Music is reduced to little more than rhythm. Dance becomes more solipsistic, self-focused, rather than a communal experience. Word and idea dominate over experience. Cultural history, tradition, and anything that can be learned from the past are confidently dismissed in preparation for the society of the future, which has been built out of pure human will. Looking at you, EAC people. The body is viewed as a machine. The natural world is viewed as a resource to be exploited. And technological or bureaucratic language become ubiquitous, being applied in every context. I'm the CEO of my life.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
I also did not like that list. But here is the good news.
And there was much rejoicing.
While it seems like the left hemisphere is closer than ever to a total and final victory, there is room for hope. The return of the right hemisphere is both possible and of ultimate importance. We've had rises in mental health problems, declines in levels of happiness and life satisfaction, ecological catastrophe, the destruction of local cultures by globalization and indiscriminate economics, a century filled with totalitarian governments focused on a great and perfect future, skyrocketing levels of loneliness despite never having been more connected, Office Space, Idiocracy, Luigi Mangione, Nicki Minaj, Severance, and some Ohio-ass skibbity. The left hemisphere is attempting to block out the right with its hall of mirrors. Now, in the religious world, religious practices are being talked about based not on their innate value as a means for us to connect to the other, shouldn't have even said means, but based on their utility.
Hey guys, hope you're enjoying the video. If you like this one, you might also like the one I posted about the biological utility of the Sabbath. I'll link it here, if I can figure out how. And I'll link it in the description. Alright, thanks guys, back to the video.
In the Reformation, the Reformers cut away the basis of religious worship in metaphors, rituals, music, and works of art, and replaced them with ideas, theories, and statements. In the world of art, pathos, appeals to emotion, were replaced by angst or angst in modernism. And now, near the end of the postmodern world, pathos is often viewed as cringe or a joke. Instead, McGilchrist says there is an ironic playfulness suggesting a sort of innocence and joy that are inappropriate to the facts. Now, interestingly, this is currently talked about in online circles as irony poisoning, which I think the fact that it has a name and is being called out and we have that awareness of it now is progress. But this irony poisoning is roughly akin to being pathologically emotionally unavailable. Here's looking at you, girls on dating apps who say that they're fluent in sarcasm.
Stop it. Get some help.
But there is hope. While the left hemisphere is convinced of its world, the real world, the outside other, is not. As time progresses, the left hemisphere will be periodically jolted from its sleepwalking into the abyss by the other that does not conform to its expectations. We've been talking about the left and the right for this whole video, but there are not two players in this game. There are three. And the one we've been neglecting is more unstoppable than the other two combined. Now, there will be growing pains, to be sure, but as Nietzsche says, the spirit grows and strength is restored by wounding. McGilchrist also notes that this left-right pattern is a Western phenomenon, and that Eastern culture, Japanese and Chinese, at least at the time of the publishing, is still relatively balanced between the hemispheres. There's a greater reverence for nature, which is even taught in Japanese schools, likely due to the influence of animism. There are even slight differences in structure of the left frontal and bilateral temporal lobes, areas associated with language, between Chinese and North American populations. Now, I would guess that this is likely due to thousands of years of using highly symbolic, ideographic language, Hanzi or kanji, rather than combinations of alphanumeric symbols, as well as the use of tones to convey meaning. For example, ma in Mandarin is mom, but ma is horse. Probably don't want to mix those up. Ultimately, McGilchrist says that we need to sophisticate the language we use to understand ourselves, particularly in the realm of science, neuroscience in particular. Because people imitate and adopt whatever language is used, the rational language of machinery that is all-encompassing now reinforces the view of ourselves as machines. A re-expansion of that rationality into the right hemisphere's world of context, the re-adoption of reason, can lead us out of this quagmire. Now, in the last 15 years, 16, since the book was published, I've seen a few changes that are hopeful, and I would guess that you have too. Now, for the first time in decades, church memberships are increasing, with surprising amounts returning to the ritual-heavy Orthodox and Catholic churches. There are recent trends in young people interested in homesteading, which indicates a renewed reverence for nature, or at the very least, a disdain for the left hemisphere's world that it's created. Some of the most robust findings in recent psychedelic research suggest that they increase interhemispheric connectivity, among other fruitful effects. And a rise in sincerity as an explicit value in popular culture, contrasted from irony, is seen in works like Ted Lasso, Everything Everywhere All at Once, Nacho Libre, and Richard Powers' The Overstory, in direct combat against the ironic detachment of postmodernism. And I'm sure there's way more. Let me know if you've noticed any trends. Let's get a hope party started down there in the comments. Now, since this book was published, we've also started to see the beginnings of potential supplanters of postmodernism as a cultural movement. So far, I've heard of three main ones, and here they are. The first is postmodernism, which I don't like. It's not all that different, and it's got a lazy name. You just put post on there, mean and after. It's like, yeah, we know it's after. Tell us something we don't know. Second, hypermodernism, also known as supermodernism. Now, this is really just a hyperbolic furtherance and inversion of postmodernism, so I'm kind of ambivalent about it. But the third is metamodernism. That's the one I'm most familiar with and am most hopeful for, because it seems to be a reasonable, right hemisphere directed step to the way out.
Put one foot in front of the other, and soon you'll be walking out the door.
Metamodernism has been defined as the cultural logic of cultural logics. Meta. Now, this is still being developed, so it's super hard to summarize in any concrete terms abstractly, though often there is a sense of ironic detachment with sincere engagement, which sounds paradoxical, but is necessary. And it has a great kind of hemispheric balance vibe to it, I think. Now, because it's hard to explain, the best way to understand what this is to engage with it by experiencing it through different media and thinkers, like these. Also, here's a great video explaining the shift to metamodernism in film. I'll link it downstairs. Now, in closing, after 461 pages plus footnotes of reading and a year and a half, McGilchrist concludes.
If it could be shown definitively that the two major ways, not just of thinking, but of being in the world, are not related to the two cerebral hemispheres, I would be surprised, but not unhappy. If it turns out to be just a metaphor, I will be content. I have a high regard for metaphor. It is how we come to understand the world. My father was a drinker and a fiend. And one night he comes home, crazier than usual. I don't remember the rest of the story.